Most people think identity is something stable hidden underneath behavior, a fixed core that exists independently from thoughts, habits, emotions, and repeated experiences. But identity does not emerge separately from repetition. It emerges through repetition. What your mind returns to consistently begins shaping what feels normal, familiar, and eventually personal. At first, repeated thoughts or behaviors may feel temporary. A reaction happens often enough that it becomes expected. A certain emotional state appears frequently enough that it starts feeling characteristic. Over time, the repetition stops feeling like something you experience and starts feeling like something you are. This transition is subtle because the mind adapts gradually. There is no clear moment where a repeated pattern transforms into identity. The system simply reduces friction around what is familiar. What repeats becomes easier to access, easier to predict, and easier to reinforce. Eventually, the repeated pattern feels natural, and once something feels natural, it is rarely questioned. This is how identity forms without requiring deliberate intention. The mind continuously strengthens pathways that are activated repeatedly, whether those pathways involve confidence, insecurity, avoidance, resentment, calmness, self-doubt, or emotional reactivity. Repetition increases accessibility. Accessibility increases familiarity. Familiarity creates the feeling that the pattern reflects your true nature. But the feeling of authenticity is often just the result of repeated activation over time. The unsettling part is that many aspects of personality are not consciously chosen. They are stabilized through exposure, emotional reinforcement, and repeated internal states that gradually become integrated into the experience of self. The mind is designed to conserve energy wherever possible. One of the most efficient ways to do this is by turning repeated patterns into automatic structures. Instead of evaluating every situation from the beginning each time, the system builds shortcuts based on prior repetition. Emotional responses become faster, interpretations become immediate, behaviors require less conscious effort. This process is useful because it creates consistency, but it also means that repeated mental states slowly become default settings. A person who repeatedly interprets social situations as threatening does not need to consciously decide to become anxious. The system gradually automates that interpretation until it becomes the expected response. The same process happens with confidence, pessimism, emotional withdrawal, anger, or self-criticism. Repetition changes the baseline from which future experiences are processed. Once a pattern becomes automatic, it no longer feels like a repeated behavior, it feels like personality. And because personality feels stable, people often assume it reflects something permanent rather than something reinforced. But the system does not distinguish strongly between what was intentionally chosen and what was repeatedly practiced. It strengthens whatever is activated consistently. Over time, the repeated pathway becomes easier to trigger than alternatives. The mind then interprets this ease as evidence that the pattern is authentic. In reality, the pattern may simply be familiar enough that the system stopped treating it as optional. Attention plays a major role in this process, because what you repeatedly focus on begins shaping the structure of your internal world. Attention is not passive observation, it is reinforcement. Whatever consistently receives attention becomes more psychologically significant over time. This means that repeated focus changes not only what you think about, but also what your mind learns to prioritize automatically. A person who repeatedly attends to rejection begins detecting rejection more easily. A person who repeatedly focuses on failure begins organizing experiences around signs of inadequacy. These attentional habits eventually shape emotional expectations and behavioral patterns. The important detail is that attention often feels voluntary even when it is heavily conditioned. Certain thoughts or emotional themes begin attracting attention automatically because the system has learned that they are important. This creates loops where attention reinforces emotional states, and emotional states reinforce attention in return. Over time, the repeated cycle becomes integrated into identity. The person no longer experiences themselves as someone who repeatedly focuses on certain patterns. They experience themselves as naturally anxious, naturally insecure, naturally defensive, naturally detached. The repeated direction of attention disappears beneath the identity it helped create. And because the process happened gradually, the final structure feels inherent rather than reinforced. Emotion strengthens repetition by attaching significance to specific patterns. Experiences with strong emotional intensity leave deeper psychological traces because the system treats emotionally charged information as more important for future prediction. This means that emotionally repeated states become especially powerful in shaping identity. If certain emotional responses occur consistently, fear, shame, resentment, guilt, inadequacy, the system begins preparing for them automatically. The emotional state becomes expected. Once expectation forms, perception changes to support it. Situations are interpreted in ways that align with the familiar emotional pattern. This creates a self-reinforcing structure where repeated emotion shapes interpretation, interpretation shapes behavior, and behavior produces experiences that reinforce the original emotional state. The person then experiences the entire loop as personality. But the identity emerged from repeated emotional conditioning, rather than from a fixed internal essence. This is why emotionally repetitive environments can shape identity so deeply. The system adapts to whatever emotional conditions occur frequently enough, and because adaptation happens automatically, the resulting identity feels self-generated, even when it was heavily shaped by repeated exposure and reinforcement over time. Language quietly stabilizes these repeated patterns by turning temporary experiences into permanent descriptions. A thought becomes a label. A behavior becomes a trait. A repeated emotional state becomes part of self-definition. The moment the mind begins describing patterns with identity-based language, reinforcement increases dramatically. Saying I feel anxious sometimes leaves room for variation. Saying I am an anxious person integrates the pattern into identity itself. Once this happens, the system begins protecting the pattern because identity stability becomes psychologically important. Behaviors, interpretations, and emotional reactions start aligning with the label automatically. This does not happen because the label is objectively true. It happens because the mind prioritizes internal consistency. Identity-based language compresses complex repeated experiences into simplified self-concepts that feel stable and coherent. The danger is that these self-concepts often continue long after the original conditions that created them have changed. But because the label now feels personal, changing the pattern begins to feel like threatening the self rather than modifying behavior. The repetition has moved beyond habit and into identity preservation. And once a pattern becomes tied to identity, the system resists contradictions automatically, even when the pattern causes suffering. Memory reinforces identity by selectively preserving patterns that align with the version of yourself the mind currently recognizes as familiar. People often assume memory functions like a neutral archive, but it behaves more like an active reconstruction system. Experiences are filtered, emphasized, and interpreted in ways that support continuity. Moments that align with existing identity structures become easier to recall and emotionally reinforce. Contradictory experiences are often minimized, forgotten, or reinterpreted until they fit the larger narrative. A person who sees themselves as inadequate will notice and remember failures with unusual clarity, while dismissing evidence of competence as temporary or accidental. A person who sees themselves as emotionally disconnected will reinterpret moments of vulnerability as exceptions rather than meaningful contradictions. Over time, memory becomes less about preserving objective events and more about maintaining psychological consistency. This creates a feedback loop where identity shapes memory, and memory strengthens identity in return. The repeated narrative feels increasingly real because the mind continuously finds evidence for it within reconstructed memories, but the evidence is already filtered through the identity structure itself. This is why deeply repeated self-concepts become difficult to challenge. The system is not simply repeating behaviors, it is reorganizing memory around those behaviors until the identity feels historically confirmed. Eventually, the person no longer experiences the pattern as something reinforced over time. They experience it as something they have always been. Social environments accelerate this process because human identity is partially constructed through repeated interaction with external expectations. The way people respond to you influences which parts of yourself become activated consistently. Certain traits are reinforced socially while others receive little attention or are discouraged entirely. Over time, repeated social reinforcement changes which behaviors feel natural to express. A person repeatedly treated as quiet may begin withdrawing automatically. A person repeatedly rewarded for emotional control may stop recognizing vulnerability as acceptable. These adaptations are rarely conscious. The system simply learns which patterns reduce friction within the environment and begins automating them. Eventually, the adaptation feels personal rather than situational. This is important because people often mistake socially conditioned behavior for independent personality. But much of what feels individual was stabilized through repeated interaction with external systems of approval, rejection, expectation, and reward. The environment does not directly dictate identity, but it strongly influences which internal pathways become reinforced through repetition. And because social reinforcement often begins early and operates continuously, its effects become deeply integrated into the structure of self-perception before conscious awareness fully understands what is happening. The brain also prioritizes familiarity over accuracy when maintaining identity structures. Familiar patterns feel psychologically safer because they are predictable. Even painful emotional states can become stabilizing if they are repeated enough. This creates a difficult dynamic where the system may unconsciously preserve harmful patterns simply because they are known. A person can remain attached to self-defeating behaviors, negative self-concepts, or emotionally painful cycles, not because they consciously prefer suffering, but because the repeated structure feels more predictable than change. Unfamiliar emotional states create uncertainty, and uncertainty increases cognitive tension. The mind often reduces this tension by returning to familiar patterns automatically. This is why meaningful change can feel psychologically disorienting even when it is objectively positive. The system experiences deviation from familiar identity structures as instability. Repetition created a sense of continuity, and continuity became associated with safety. Once that association forms, the mind begins protecting the repeated pattern regardless of whether the pattern is beneficial. What feels like resistance to change is often the system attempting to preserve psychological predictability. The repeated identity structure no longer functions merely as a set of behaviors. It functions as an organizing framework the mind relies on to maintain coherence and reduce uncertainty. This process becomes even stronger because repeated internal experiences change future perception automatically. Once a pattern stabilizes, the mind begins anticipating it before it occurs. Emotional states, reactions, and expectations become predictive frameworks. A person who repeatedly experiences rejection begins expecting rejection before interactions fully unfold. A person who repeatedly experiences failure begins predicting inadequacy before effort even begins. These expectations influence attention, behavior, interpretation, and emotional response in ways that quietly increase the probability of confirming the original pattern. The system is no longer reacting neutrally to reality. It is interacting with reality through structures built from repeated past experiences. This creates the impression that identity reflects objective truth because experiences continue aligning with the established pattern, but many of those experiences are being filtered and shaped by predictive expectations generated internally. Repetition created the framework, and the framework now influences future outcomes. Over time, the distinction between internal conditioning and external reality becomes increasingly difficult to detect. The repeated identity structure begins organizing perception itself, reinforcing the feeling that the pattern represents an unchangeable part of who you are. The shift begins when repetition itself becomes visible. Most people focus on the content of their thoughts, emotions, and behaviors without recognizing the deeper pattern underneath them. But the real force shaping identity is not any single moment. It is the repeated return. The same emotional interpretations, the same attentional patterns, the same internal narratives, the same reactions reinforced over time until they become automatic. Once repetition is recognized as the mechanism, identity starts looking less like a fixed essence and more like an adaptive structure continuously reinforced through activation. This does not mean identity is fake. It means identity is dynamic, shaped by what the system repeatedly practices and protects. And this changes the meaning of change itself. Transformation no longer depends on discovering a hidden true self underneath conditioning. It depends on altering what the mind consistently returns to over time. Because repetition built the structure, repetition is also what maintains it. And once that becomes visible, the relationship between awareness and identity changes completely. Habits become psychologically powerful because the mind does not clearly separate repeated action from personal identity. A behavior performed consistently begins altering expectations about the self. At first, habits feel external, like things you do. But repetition gradually changes the way the system predicts future behavior. Once prediction changes, identity starts adapting around it. A person who repeatedly avoids difficult situations begins expecting avoidance automatically. A person who consistently practices discipline begins expecting follow-through automatically. These expectations influence future decisions before conscious intention fully appears. The system starts preparing for the behavior it has repeated most often because repetition increases predictive confidence. This creates a subtle but important shift. The habit no longer feels optional. It feels characteristic. And once a behavior feels characteristic, it becomes integrated into self-image. This is why repeated actions often matter more than occasional intentions. The system trusts patterns more than isolated moments of motivation, because patterns are more useful for prediction. Identity therefore becomes shaped less by what a person occasionally wants, and more by what the system repeatedly experiences as normal behavior. Over time, repeated actions stop feeling like evidence of behavior and start feeling like evidence of who the person fundamentally is. The line between habit and identity becomes increasingly difficult to distinguish because the brain compresses repeated behavior into stable expectations about the self. Internal narration strengthens these identity structures by creating continuity between separate experiences. The mind constantly interprets events through narrative frameworks that explain what situations mean and what they imply about the self. These narratives are rarely neutral. They organize experiences around repeated themes. A mistake becomes evidence of inadequacy. Social discomfort becomes evidence of rejection. Emotional distance becomes evidence of personal failure. The narrative does not simply describe experiences, it connects them into stable psychological patterns. Once enough events are linked together through the same interpretive framework, the narrative begins functioning as identity reinforcement. Future experiences are then processed through that framework automatically. This means the same event can strengthen completely different identities depending on how it is interpreted repeatedly over time. Two people can experience similar failures while constructing entirely different internal narratives about what those failures mean. The narrative itself becomes part of the repetition mechanism. It stabilizes interpretation across time, making repeated emotional conclusions feel coherent and inevitable. And because the narrative develops gradually through countless small reinforcements, it rarely feels constructed. It feels discovered. The person assumes they are uncovering truths about themselves when they are often strengthening repeated interpretations that became psychologically familiar through repetition. Emotional recovery patterns also shape identity in ways that are easy to miss. It is not only the emotional reaction itself that matters, but how the system repeatedly returns to stability afterward. Some people consistently recover from discomfort through withdrawal. Others recover through control, distraction, reassurance-seeking, anger, or emotional suppression. These recovery mechanisms become automatic because they reduce immediate psychological tension. But over time, the repeated method of regulation begins shaping identity structures around it. A person who repeatedly regulates fear through avoidance gradually builds an identity organized around caution and perceived vulnerability. A person who repeatedly regulates insecurity through perfectionism builds an identity dependent on control and performance. The important detail is that these patterns often begin as adaptive responses to emotional discomfort, not deliberate personality choices, but repetition transforms temporary coping mechanisms into stable self-concepts. Eventually, the individual no longer experiences the behavior as regulation. They experience it as personality. The coping strategy disappears beneath the identity it helped construct. And because the strategy continues reducing short-term discomfort, the system keeps reinforcing it automatically, even when it creates long-term limitations. The reason repeated patterns become so convincing is because familiarity produces a sensation of truth. What the mind encounters consistently begins feeling self-evident, even when the pattern was originally arbitrary or conditioned. This applies to thoughts, emotional reactions, behaviors, and self-concepts. Repetition reduces cognitive resistance. The more often a pathway is activated, the less effort it requires to access again. Ease of access then becomes psychologically misinterpreted as authenticity. A repeated thought feels true because it appears quickly and effortlessly. A repeated emotional response feels natural because it emerges automatically. But automaticity is not evidence of accuracy. It is evidence of reinforcement. The system becomes increasingly efficient at reproducing what it practices most often. Over time, the repeated structure begins operating with so little friction that alternatives feel unnatural by comparison. The illusion that the established identity reflects something fundamental rather than something repeatedly strengthened. The person trusts the pattern because it feels immediate, familiar, and stable, but those sensations are often the result of repetition itself rather than objective truth about who the person inherently is. Once repetition becomes visible as the mechanism shaping identity, the idea of personal change stops depending on dramatic transformation. Identity is not rebuilt all at once because identity was never constructed all at once. It emerged gradually through repeated activation of certain pathways over others. This means that change operates through the same mechanism that built the existing structure in the first place. The system adapts to what it experiences consistently. New patterns initially feel artificial not because they are false, but because they are unfamiliar. Old patterns feel authentic not because they are permanent, but because they were repeated long enough to become efficient. This reframes the entire relationship between self and behavior. Instead of searching for a hidden real self underneath conditioning, attention shifts toward the patterns being continuously reinforced in the present. Identity becomes less like a fixed object and more like an ongoing process shaped through repetition, attention, emotional reinforcement, and interpretation over time. And once that becomes clear, the self stops appearing as something permanently discovered. It begins appearing as something continuously practiced.